The galaxy fell silent in horror as humans left the Galactic Council forever. The central display of the registry panel turned an absolute, unblinking gray line. 81 Vanguard programs lost their confirmation codes in the exact same fraction of a second. The high warships of the Sothran hegemony did not tear apart under weapons fire, nor did their plasma engines explode into white heat. Instead, their automated cooling loops simply closed under legal reclamation mandates. Across 14 sectors, thick isolation gates dropped into place, locking 14 entire battle groups in dead dark. High Arbitrator Xylerkesh did not strike his gavel. His 4 lidless visual pits fixed on the screen, narrowing until the slate-gray plates around his jaw clicked. On the floor below him, Specialist Marrow Vance stepped away from the short podium and smoothed her left cuff. She did not ask for permission to speak. She did not check if the terminal was recording. "We did not come to debate the borders, Arbitrator," Marrow Vance said. Her voice carried no heat. It was the dry, flat tone of an auditor reading an inventory sheet. "We came to close the accounts." The room remained cold. The acoustic dead glass of the Obsidian Tier Grand Tribunal swallowed the echo before it could reach the upper benches. "I wish I could tell you the Assembly found a way out of that room. They didn't. Stay close." 3 months before the gray line appeared on the central display, the air in Chamber 7 smelled of recycled nitrogen and the mineral bite of ion-filtered light. It was a standard administrative session. The high tables were cluttered with trade manifests, transit logs, and thin leather folios that had not been opened in half a century. Marrow Vance stood at the human podium. The builders of the chamber had set the stone platform 4 inches lower than the others, meaning she had to look up to face the central tier. She did not use a stool. She simply adjusted her charcoal linen uniform jacket and laid her first document onto the reading glass. Behind the high stone bench, Xylerkesh leaned forward. His massive chitinous shoulders, scarred from 3 centuries of internal alliance wars, cast a heavy shadow over the lower floor. He did not look at Vance. He was drumming his secondary pair of digits against his bench. A rhythmic, dry tapping that usually meant an entry was being filed under irrelevant before it was even read. Vance set a small object on the ledge. It was a heavy, hand-wound brass transit timer with an exposed balance wheel. She turned the key twice. The internal spring caught, producing an uneven, metallic click shutter that broke the smooth, rhythmic hum of the room's atmospheric processors. "The first log," Vance stated, her fingers leaving the brass casing. 14 months ago, the outer margin of Sector 9, a third-tier transport group under Terran registration, was halted by 3 Vanguard corvettes belonging to the Sothran Assembly. Xylerkesh stopped his tapping. One of his lower visual pits shifted toward the brass timer, then back to his personal data slate. The transport was out of its designated lane. The archive shows the matter was settled by standard tariff collection. The transport was inside the Marathi buffer zone, Vance corrected. Her hand remained flat on the stone. The tariff was an unrecorded seizure of 42 tons of refined structural alloy. We logged the transponder signatures of the corvettes. We logged the crew names. We logged the fuel consumption. She did not wait for a response. She touched the interface and the second document loaded. The second log, 11 days later, the same sector. The routine of the chamber was ancient and rigid. For 400 years, the Sothran hegemony had maintained that minor species did not possess the bureaucratic endurance to track structural errors. If a supply ship vanished or a border post was squeezed for fuel, the paperwork to file a grievance required 6 separate tier validations. Most systems simply dropped the claim. It was cheaper to lose the alloy than to pay the filing fees. But the human did not look at the fees. Every 20 seconds, the brass timer on her ledge gave its dry click shutter, and every 20 seconds, a new coordinate matrix appeared on the chamber's central display. By the time the suns outside the glass had cleared the lower ring of the capital station, Vance had reached the 12th entry. Her voice had not changed pitch once. She spoke with the steady, exhausting rhythm of a machine calculating a tide. She named dates. She named the engine serial numbers of Sothran patrol craft. She named the precise depth of the weapon scars left on outer rim relay stations. Zylerkesh leaned back. His lidless eyes didn't blink, but the gray chitin along his neck began to puff, a behavioral tell that his line commanders knew to fear. It meant he was no longer listening to the words. He was counting the cost of the disruption. "Specialist," the High Arbitrator interrupted, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "The assembly does not require a physical reading of logistics reports. These items are secondary garbage. They belong in the sub-tier filing vaults, not on the floor of the High Grand Tribunal." "The 17th log," Vance said, as if he had not spoken at all. 3 weeks ago, the Sector 9 Outer Rim Transit Hub, a civilian repair crew was ordered to evacuate their berth within 6 minutes to allow an unflagged Sothran cruiser to take the line. "A security detail necessity," Zylerkesh snapped. He reached for the large obsidian gavel at the center of his bench. "The assembly retains structural priority over all rim berths. Your numbers are accurate, but your presence here is a structural violation." "The cruiser was not on a security detail," Vance said. She smoothed her left cuff. "Its cargo hold was filled with structural alloy seized during the first 12 incidents. The vessel registration belongs to your third-line commander." The High Arbitrator's hand closed around the handle of the gavel. The stone was cold, carved from an erasure block that had been used to seal the sovereign end of 3 older species who had refused compliance. He did not look at the files on his screen. He looked down at the low podium, at the small human woman whose linen uniform showed no insignias of high military rank. "You have been logging our patrol movements for 90 days, Zylerkesh murmured. It was not an inquiry. It was the declaration of a system that had decided where the boundary lay. "We have been logging your movements for 31 years, Vance replied. The High Arbitrator lifted the gavel. "Under the authority of the ancient charter," he declared, his voice rising until it filled the dead space of the tier, "and under the precedent established during the Third Consolidation era, the chair invokes the Edict of Administrative Silence." He brought the stone down. The impact was an absolute flat crack that carried no echo. Instantly, the indicator lights around the human podium changed from green to a hard, fixed blue. The vocal transmission array embedded in the stone died. Vance's lips moved, finishing her sentence, but no sound came out. The automated security matrix of the chamber had already isolated her platform, cutting its power, locking its data inputs, and logging a sovereign hold on every file she had uploaded during the session. The silence that followed was total. In the gallery above, 3 minor delegates from the outer worlds looked down, their hands completely still on their ledges. They had seen this move twice before in their lifetimes. They knew what the blue light meant. The human chair was now dead on the floor. Vance did not pull back her hands from the ledge. She stood entirely still for 3 seconds while the brass transit timer between her fingers gave one final, uneven click shudder. Then, she picked up her physical paper notes. She did not look up at the high tier, nor did she look at the security detail that had begun to move down the stairs toward her platform. She turned her head slightly toward the western gallery, her eyes fixed directly on the corner bench where the senior liaison for the neutral star factions sat behind a mountain of unread transfer receipts. She held the look for 2 seconds. Then she walked off the floor. Her steps were perfectly even as she crossed the dark volcanic glass of the exit lane. She did not run. She did not leave a single paper behind. When the heavy outer doors of Chamber 7 slid shut behind her charcoal uniform, the silence in the room did not break. It merely changed weight. Zylerkesh turned his data slate over, his jaw plates settling back into their default alignment. The human seat is recorded as non-compliant. The 34 incident logs are held pending a sovereignty review by the High Line Command. He cleared his screen with a single swipe. For 72 hours, the human chair remained empty. No replacement documentarian arrived from the outer rim. No formal protest was filed through the central communication network. The Terran embassy on the 3rd level of the station did not close its doors, but every light inside their operational offices went dark at the exact same hour. To the rest of the assembly, It looked like the standard withdrawal pattern of a short-lived species that had run out of procedural options. They had hit the wall of the old laws, and the wall had not moved. On the morning of the third cycle, an automated transmission arrived at the central registry hub. It did not go to Zyler Kesh's private terminal. It loaded directly onto the public bulletin, where all 71 member worlds tracked active agendas. The message was exactly 4 sentences long. It cited the Silence Edict by its exact article code. It noted the public broadcast record of the blue light activation in Chamber 7. It stated that the Terran Confederation was withdrawing its membership, its resource allocations, and its security obligations from the hegemony effective within 60 seconds. The last sentence read, "The ledger will speak for itself." Zyler Kesh received the notification while checking the morning fuel trade balances at his bench. He let out a low, dry rasp from his upper throat, the Sothran equivalent of a laugh. "They will return within 3 cycles," he told the senior preceptor sitting to his left. "Their entire outer rim logistics chain relies on our transit berths. A species without armor cannot trade in deep space without a license from the House." He did not look up from his slate to see the neutral liaison in the western gallery reach for her personal terminal with trembling fingers. The liaison was not reading the public withdrawal notice. She was staring at an automated system log that had just bypassed her terminal's firewall. Under Article 12, subsection F of the Ancient Hegemony Code, a rule written 4 centuries ago and never once invoked, if a member world left the assembly while under an active gag order, all sealed evidence held in the central registry did not vanish. It automatically transferred to their designated analytical liaison for independent validation. And the humans had put her name in the registry 3 months ago. The liaison touched her interface. The file block arrived in less than 11 seconds. It was not a collection of border reports. It was a single, massive data block measuring 3.4 petabytes of clinical, high-density military intelligence. At the top of the folder, a red digital clock had already begun to run down from 72 hours. The clock had started the exact millisecond she opened the file. The liaison, whose name in the registry was marked as the Neutral Verification Authority, did not look away from the numbers. The data did not contain requests for help or legal briefs. It was an active directory of 81 separate military vanguard groups, laid out alongside their supply chains and funding nodes. She spent the first 6 hours of the countdown verifying the authentication keys. Every file carried the digital signature of the Sothran Central Bank, pulled directly from logs that required senior clearance to view. The humans had not broken into the network through force. They had simply spent 31 years collecting the crumbs left behind by every trade audit, every berth reallocation, and every minor border seizure. By the 10th hour, the liaison found the Deadman Protocol document. It was attached to a routine file regarding old grain shipments to the outer sectors. The text was 3 short paragraphs long, written in the dry, unvarnished vocabulary of a standard operating guide. The protocol stated that if a non-human custodian opened the archive following an administrative silence decree, an automated broadcast network would activate. The red countdown clock on her screen was the time remaining before the package sent itself to every star faction the Sothran hegemony had positioned its battle groups against over the last decade. The file contained more than troop numbers. It held the exact frequency shifts for Sothran shield generators, the structural weak points of 14 orbital drydocks, and the private banking codes of 12 sector preceptors. If the timer reached 0, the hegemony would not just face an argument. It would face total tactical exposure before 6 different armed rivals at the exact same moment. The liaison's hands grew cold against her interface terminal. She touched the emergency communication node, trying to flag the Terran embassy line. The terminal gave a flat, low chime. The line was dead. The humans had pulled their physical relay modules out of the station infrastructure 60 seconds after Marrow Vance left Chamber 7. She tried 4 separate deep space routing addresses listed for the Terran Logistics Command. Each query bounced back within milliseconds, stamped with the same clinical system code, destination unavailable. The Confederation had closed its doors, turned off its receivers, and left the house. They were not waiting for an apology. A low chime from the primary screen broke her focus. The countdown clock had just crossed the 50-hour mark. At the same hour, on the upper tier of the station, High Arbitrator Galactic was leading a closed review of the resource distribution maps. The empty human chair on the lower level did not concern him. The trade reports from the Sector 9 transit hub showed that 3 minor merchant fleets from the Outer Rim had already delayed their departures, worried about the sudden lack of Terran security escorts along the shipping lanes. They will sue for a new transit charter before the turn of the cycle, the High Arbitrator told his advisors. His lidless visual pits remained fixed on the mineral revenue columns. A species that uses cloth for uniforms cannot sustain a defensive line without our fuel yards. The human documentarian left her transit timer on the podium, the senior preceptor noted, pointing toward the lower floor. The security detail did not remove it because the internal spring is still moving. Galactic did not look down. It will run out of tension, everything does. But in the lower archives, the neutral liaison was staring at the second layer of the human dossier. She had reached the directory marked for the Sothran Central Security Division. It contained 9 years of private operational logs from an insider within Galactic's own ministerial staff, an analyst who had been copying access registries and transferring them to Terran data nodes during every seasonal audit. The insider was not a human agent. It was a high-ranking Sothran clerk who had been passed over for promotion during the third consolidation era. The humans had not paid him in currency. They had simply kept a record of every balance sheet he had ever corrected, building a quiet ledger of compliance that made his cooperation inevitable. The liaison leaned back from the glass bench. The scale of the collection was too vast to be the work of a single embassy team. Someone had gone through the registries one name at a time, the colony rolls, the orbital stations, the private accounts of every line commander, and beside the total had written a single word in black digital ink: verified. The countdown clock dropped into the 30-hour window. The numbers turned from a pale orange to a sharp, steady crimson. The liaison knew that if she stayed in her office when the timer expired, her signature would be embedded in the broadcast header. The ancient charter protected a neutral custodian from military execution, but it did not protect them from the political fallout of a liquidated empire. She had to find the human authorization code to cancel the transmission before the final relay opened. She left her alcove and crossed the secondary transit levels toward the abandoned Terran sector. The corridors were entirely silent, stripped of the small brass signs and digital directories that usually marked a foreign delegation's office. The air valves had been turned down to minimum maintenance levels, leaving the halls cold and heavy with the smell of stale insulation. When she reached the main entrance of the embassy, she found the security lock had been physically welded shut from the inside. A simple plate of gray structural alloy had been fused over the electronic keypads. She touched the metal plate. It was still slightly warm to the touch. Beside the fused lock, hanging from a single plastic clip on the doorframe, was a small square of plain white paper. It did not carry a code or a cryptographic cipher. It was a printed list of 14 coordinates within the Marathi buffer zone, the exact locations Marrow Vance had been reading into the record before her microphone was cut. The liaison pulled her personal scanner from her uniform pocket and traced the paper's edge. The device gave a soft click, registering a hidden low-frequency signal buried within the paper fibers. It was an automated system pulse, ticking every 20 seconds in perfect synchronization with the transit timer left on the chamber podium. The pulse was not a cancellation key. It was a secondary trigger. The scanner screen updated, pulling a fresh subfolder from the petabyte archive in her office terminal. The humans had not just built a Deadman switch for the Sothran military files. They had attached a separate data block containing the precise coordinates of every civilian processing plant and transport grid along the hegemony's northern border. The liaison watched the coordinates update in real time as the red clock ticked down. The civilian files were locked behind a different layer of security, labeled with a brief note from the Terran Logistics Command, Infrastructure Annex. She realized then that the archive did not end with the military exposures. If the timer hit 0, the broadcast would not just reveal where the warships were hiding, it would lay bare the survival networks of 40 million citizens who relied on those northern processing plants for daily water filtration. The humans had mapped the heart of the home worlds. She returned to her archive alcove with 12 hours left on the clock. The red numbers were large now, filling the upper display of her main interface, casting a thin, bloody glow over the glass walls of the room. Every terminal on her bench was humming at full power, her system protocols straining under the sheer weight of the 3.4 petabytes of data waiting for the broadcast gates to drop. She sat down and smoothed her uniform sleeves. Her fingers were shaking so much she had to rest her hands flat against the ledge for several seconds before she could begin typing the final override sequence. The system did not accept her security tokens. The override box remained grayed out, locked behind a terminal interface that required a physical biometric handshake from a Terran authority officer. With 6 hours remaining, the liaison stopped trying to crack the lock. She simply watched the lines of code align themselves into the transmission bays. The automated routing matrix was selecting its targets now: 6 rival star factions, 32 neutral planetary states, and every public information board across 71 sectors. The Empire's foundation was about to be pulled out in public view. On the morning of the 4th cycle, exactly 72 hours after Specialist Vance had walked out of Chamber 7, the countdown clock reached its final 60 seconds. High Arbitrator Zylerkesh was back on his throne, preparing to call the assembly to order for the afternoon session. The empty human podium sat below him, dark and unpowered under its blue light status ring. The dry click shutter of the brass transit timer on the ledge gave a low, metallic twang and stopped moving. Its spring had finally run out of tension. Zylerkesh lifted his obsidian gavel to strike the opening bench. In the western gallery, the liaison's primary terminal gave one long, unbroken whistle. The crimson numbers on her display vanished, replaced by an absolute black screen that held a single row of green text. Transmission verified, custodial signature applied. The liaison did not look up to see the gavel hit the stone. She was watching her secondary monitor, where the first information columns from the Sothran Central Security Division began to load onto the public network. At the exact same moment, every terminal on the High Arbitrator's bench flickered once and went gray. High Arbitrator Zylerkesh did not call the guards. He did not speak into his dead vocal array. He simply watched the gray line on his slate change into a fast-scrolling list of raw financial data. The central display grid of the Grand Tribunal did not flash a warning. It remained a flat, cold silver, but the information loading onto the public network was changing the balance of the room every second. In the western gallery, the neutral liaison sat perfectly still, her hands hovering an inch above her terminal. Her interface showed the first wave of funding holds dropping into the Sothran Central Bank registry. The Sothran war machine did not lose its ships to an orbital strike. It lost its authorization tokens. Across 14 sectors, 14 line commanders found themselves looking at unpowered command slates, their propulsion systems locked behind automated compliance reviews that required a Terran confirmation code to clear. "The registry is blocking the fuel lanes," the senior preceptor whispered, his neck chitin puffing to twice its normal size. "The central bank has frozen the Vanguard accounts under the Asset Reclamation Clause. They are labeling our entire offensive deployment as a non-compliant liability." Zylerkesh turned his head toward the lower floor. The empty human chair sat under its hard blue light ring, a silent reminder of the edict he had invoked 72 hours before. He reached out and touched his screen, attempting to log a sovereign override code through the main ministerial staff node. The terminal did not accept his gesture. The screen remained gray, its display showing an automated system refusal that cited the silence edict by article number. By using the old laws to mute Marrow Vance, The High Arbitrator had legally validated the closure of the record, and the system was now executing the consequences of that closure with absolute precision. The silence that followed was different from the first one. This silence meant understood. Within 30 minutes, the fallout hit the station's trade levels. 3 major shipping syndicates from the Outer Rim cut their dock ties early, their captains refusing to load cargo, while the central bank's tracking network was in a state of automated asset freeze. The fuel yards, the repair berths, the transit loops, every piece of station infrastructure controlled by Sothran funds dropped to minimum maintenance output simultaneously. The liaison watched the transmission line stabilize. The data package had already cleared the local relay nodes, carrying the exact frequency maps of the hegemony's shield networks to 6 rival star factions at the exact same hour. The information was too dense to be intercepted. Any attempt to shut down the public boards would require cutting the station's primary core, which would leave 44 assembly sectors completely blind in deep space. They are not issuing demands, the liaison murmured to herself, her screen tracking the movement of the file columns. They are simply updating the ledger. Zylerkesh stood up from his throne. His massive frame cast a dark shadow across the central tier as he looked at the 70 delegates sitting in the upper galleries. His secondary digits were completely still against his side armor, his default behavioral tell of irritated tapping gone. The Terran Confederation has committed a procedural violation, the High Arbitrator declared, his gravelly voice flat and clinical despite the dead terminals around him. The Assembly will vote to void the withdrawal notice retroactively. The border files will be sealed by executive decree before the turn of the cycle. He lifted his hand to signal the clerk block. Before a single scribe could touch an interface, the main directory screen at the center of the hall updated. It did not display a legal brief or an appeal from Earth's Logistics Command. It displayed a list. The liaison leaned forward, her eyes widening as the new information block loaded into her terminal. The folder was not part of the military intelligence package she had spent 2 days analyzing. It was a completely fresh transmission, timed to open exactly 30 minutes after the Deadman protocol verified its first relay. The heading read, Dependent Routing Register. The file contained the names, tracking numbers, and transport berths of 4.1 million Sothran individuals. They were not line soldiers or sector preceptors. They were the civilian dependents of the very personnel staffing the frozen vanguard groups along the northern border. Beside each name was a verified timestamp showing an allocation to a neutral humanitarian corridor across 6 separate junction systems. The liaison ran her scanner over the top registry row. The verification tags did not match the morning's transmission. The timestamps showed that these civilian safety files had been prepared, validated, and logged into the neutral transit network 3 weeks prior to the session, before Marrow Vance had even walked into Chamber 7, before the High Arbitrator had touched his obsidian gavel. The room grew so cold that the moisture from the air filters began to frost along the edges of the lower podium. The Sothran line planners sitting behind the High Arbitrator did not speak. They stared at the coordinate maps accompanying the civilian register. The humans had not just mapped the defenses of the home worlds. They had deployed their own medical frigates and supply convoys to the border junctions weeks before anyone in the room had given them a reason to strike. The mercy was not a response to the silencing. It was the plan. Zylerkesh did not bring down his hand, his lidless visual pits fixed on the red timestamp scrolling across his dead terminal screen. For 3 centuries, his alliance strategies had been built on the certainty that an underdog would fight for territory, for resource margins, or for political survival. He had never once designed a campaign against an opponent who spent their preparation cycle organizing the survival of their enemy's children. They knew the edict would be invoked, the senior preceptor said, his voice dropping to a raw, ragged whisper that carried across the quiet chamber floor. They didn't come here to win an argument. They built the field hospitals before we even drafted the silence order. The liaison picked up her personal slate and logged her initial field summary. Her hands were no longer shaking. The The dry, methodical reality of the human strategy had settled into her own data tracking, clearing away the lingering tension of the countdown. She looked at the empty human platform, then back at the red civilian lists filling the public boards. "The infrastructure needs no guards," she wrote into her report. She reached for her travel flask, unscrewed the metal cap, and took a short sip of cold water without looking away from the display screen. Then, she opened the final subfolder of the petabyte package. The third data drop loaded in one long, clean line of green text. It held the names of 2,300,000 human personnel, the total casualty register from 31 years of unaddressed border incursions inside the Marathi buffer zone. At the bottom of the list, a final sentence was written in plain, unadorned prose. "We are done here." The liaison watched Zylerkesh's jaw plates tighten until a thin line of blue pigment appeared along his lower chin. The high arbitrator did not return to his throne. He stood flat-footed on his stone tier, his gaze fixed on the names of the dead that had begun to cover every square inch of the chamber's common glass. The assembly didn't break into shouting. The delegates from the 70 world states sat in absolute, terrified silence, watching the numbers run out. The delegate from the third world state was the first to change his vote. He did not make a speech. He simply touched his dark interface panel, switching his alignment mark from the Southern Alliance column to the Open Consensus Register. Within 4 minutes, 42 other panels flickered, matching his choice. The ancient charter required a 2/3 majority to alter a standing decree, but the numbers scrolling across the common glass left no room for institutional debate. The assembly did not discuss the borders or the resource tariffs. They voted in total silence to strike the edict of administrative silence from the Galactic record. High Arbitrator Zylerkesh did not lift his gavel to stop the sequence. The stone remained flat on the black bench, its gray surface cold under the dimming light of the hall. Under the new mandatory provision of the amended charter, a leader who invoked a gag order against a member world that subsequently withdrew was legally required to read the silenced party's active casualty ledger into the public record. He stood alone on the stone tier. He adjusted his slate-gray shoulder armor by an inch, smoothing the plate where a long-past border campaign had left a deep, jagged groove. Then he reached down, touched the screen, and loaded the first page of the human dead. "The first entry," Zylerkesh read. His gravelly voice did not tilt. It carried the slow, heavy rhythm of an engine turning in an empty hold. "Lieutenant David Wren, age 26, stationed at the Marathi margin post." The room remained cold. The acoustic dead volcanic glass of the chamber swallowed the name before it could reach the upper galleries. He did not stop. He read for 4 hours. He named the scouts who had vanished in the outer sectors. He named the logistics clerks whose transport pods had been squeezed out of the shipping lanes during the seasonal fuel reallocations. He named the engineers, the survey crews, and the line officers. At the 3-hour mark, he reached a single name near the middle of the register: Sarah Vance, age 7, recorded during the second resource extraction at the Sector 9 transit hub. In the western gallery, the neutral liaison looked down at her slate, her fingers resting flat against the edge of the glass bench. She recognized the family name. She did not look up at the empty human podium, nor did she check the transmission lines. She remembered the early documentarian Maro Vance, smoothing her gray uniform cuff before her microphone went dead mid-sentence. The human had not brought an official military grievance to the floor. She had brought her own family inventory. The high arbitrator's voice grew raw as he reached the final section of the list, but his head did not turn away from the reading glass once. "The final entries," he stated, his lower jaw plates clicking against his neck armor as he read the last row of digits. 2,300,000. He closed the terminal with a single swipe. The crimson light from the display vanished, leaving the central floor in a pale, flat gray shadow. The human podium remained dark. The blue status ring had turned off when the edict was struck from the charter, but no fresh data lines loaded onto the human screen. The Terran Confederation had not left a representative behind to accept the compliance mark or to sign the new transit charter. Their withdrawal was complete. The liaison filed her final report that evening from her alcove terminal. Her message was brief, stripped of the standard administrative codes and protocol headers that usually filled her seasonal summaries. "The record is finished," she wrote into the central file bay. "I do not believe this was the complete archive." She stood up from her glass bench and looked across the empty hall. Every delegate had left the tier, leaving the high tables cluttered with unread manifests and dark data folios. The lower floor was still. On the edge of the short human podium, where the stone had been cut low to force a younger civilization to look up, the brass transit timer sat abandoned on the stone ledge. Its internal spring had completely run out of tension, its balance wheel frozen between two steel teeth. The heavy casing showed no marks of rank or signature, but the plain metal faced the high throne, its shadow long and thin against the volcanic floor. The liaison turned off her desk interface, picked up her travel case, and walked toward the exit lane. She did not leave a single note behind. Outside the glass, the great station turned against the dark. The stars along the Marathi margin did not flash or signal. They simply stayed where they were, cold and fixed in the deep, unblinking gray void.